Hello and welcome. This is Redditosker, and I'm back from a rather long vacation. After I hit 10,000 subscribers, I decided to take a little break, and I haven't really kept up with the channel or posted anything in like 2 weeks. And in that time, apparently my Ace Attorney review did really well while I wasn't looking, and most of the views that it got came from people that have never been to the channel before, which is nice. So now that I'm going to be getting back into it, I thought it'd be a good idea to do a follow-up to that video, and share my thoughts on something that was brought to my attention during the break. Namely, how racism is depicted in The Great Ace Attorney. And more importantly, why those depictions of racism are thematically important to the story the game is trying to develop. So to begin with, we need to first go back and put this whole thing into proper context. And the only way to do that is to look at some Japanese history. In 1852, Commodore Matthew C. Perry was tasked by the American president at the time to go to Japan and force the Japanese to open their trading ports to America. Now, this was not an easy task because at the time the Japanese were an isolationist society. They didn't want to open their ports to Western powers, and they weren't interested in adopting all of this Western influence. So to accomplish his goal, Commodore Perry resorted to using gunboat diplomacy, which means basically that he used a show of military strength, and various other intimidation tactics, as well as veiled and open threats. Among those tactics was completely ignoring the Japanese lines, refusing to meet with low-level Japanese officials, pointing the guns on his ship towards the Japanese town of Uraga, and firing blanks. When Matthew Perry finally landed, he landed with 250 sailors and Marines. They also did a 13-gun salute, and the Marines played Hail Columbia. At one point during negotiations, Commodore Perry ran out of patience, and threatened to bring 100 ships and declare war on Japan. Notably, at the time, the United States didn't have 100 ships in its fleet, but I suppose that's beside the point. Eventually, Commodore Perry did get what he wanted, though. The Japanese signed the Kanagawa Treaty, and ended the Japanese's 220-year-old policy of national seclusion. They soon after signed similar treaties with other Western powers. And as you might expect with any kind of treaty signed under these circumstances, the treaties favored the West more than it did the Japanese. Their encounters with the West left the Japanese feeling undermined, humiliated, and coerced into these treaties. But they were also impressed by the technology that the West possessed. Among the many gifts that Commodore Perry brought to his second visit to Japan was a miniature train, complete with miniature rails, that he assembled and demonstrated for the Japanese. By all accounts, the Japanese were very impressed with the train. These events paved the road to the Meiji era in Japan. The Meiji era was typified by an obsession with modernization. They modernized everything they could get their hands on: agriculture, industry, factories, ships, trains, and most importantly, the military. You see, the Japanese didn't like being seen as Eastern barbarians. They modernized so rapidly, partially because they wanted to be seen as equals in the world stage, and as a means to resist coercion from the great powers at the time. And it is in this interesting time period that The Great Ace Attorney takes place, a time when Japan is mostly subservient to Western powers but is rapidly modernizing, a time when the sun never sets on the British Empire, a time when the English are at the forefront of the world and are unashamed of their strength. So with that in mind, let's look at the events of The Great Ace Attorney again now that we have a proper context and understand what's going on. This following part is going to be chock full of spoilers, so if you haven't played the game yet and you intend to, I really recommend you go do that first. In the first case of Ace Attorney, we're introduced to the setting. It takes place during the Meiji era, at the time where Japan is rapidly modernizing. Even the legal system is adopting Western influences. Ryunosuke, Susato, and Kazuma all romanticize Britain. They see it as more enlightened than Japan, and one of the reasons that Kazuma wants to go there so desperately is because he wants to reform the Japanese legal system, and he needs to go to Britain to do that. But a reoccurring theme in the game is that things are not what they appear. For example, even though the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Friendship and Navigation between Japan and the Great British Empire has just recently been signed, the truth is that the Japanese government is still unwilling to stand up to the British Empire. And so this trial involving the murder of a British citizen is conducted in secrecy. with the Japanese government putting pressure on the courts to have a conviction of Ryunosuke by a set deadline. And even the police received orders from higher up to hide the fact that Jezebel Brett was present at the scene of the crime. And then the police pressured the witnesses not to mention her existence. And so when Jezebel Brett is finally presented to the court, we see this almost idyllic, regal, beautiful British lady who doesn't speak Japanese, and then the courtroom goes wild. Prosecutor Auchi spends the entire case simping hard for her, and the judge starts off doing that as well, impressed by her Britishness, demanding that tea be brought as soon as she's seen. But then the reality turns out to be that this beautiful English lady is actually the most virulent racist I've ever seen depicted in a video game. She doesn't hide the fact that she sees the Japanese as barbarians playing at court, and that she sees this entire trial as a game, and that she doesn't fear the consequences of what's going to happen here. And she was right not to be afraid, because after the trial concluded and she was proven to be the murderer, it turns out she can't be tried in Japan. She's going to be sent out and tried outside the country at a consular court. And the reason that's important is that the Anglo-Japanese Friendship Treaty has already been signed. Consular courts were supposed to be a thing of the past. But the truth is, it doesn't matter what the treaty says. The British can throw their weight around however they like. And so this case is depicting the cowardice of the Japanese government, and the lengths that they're willing to go to mollify the British Empire. It's depicting a period in time where they felt looked down on as backwater savages by the great powers of the world. This feeling of being looked down on, and the desire to modernize to be seen as equals to the Western powers, is absolutely essential for the plot of this story. It's a reoccurring theme that happens several times. And I just don't see how you could depict that feeling, that time, without showing racism. The game isn't glorifying racism, it's just depicting it. And it's not depicting it in a positive light, either. In fact, this whole theme of things aren't what they seem is applied most heavily to the British Empire once you actually get there. Even though the main characters see it as this paragon of the law, and legal progress and progress in many ways, by the end of it, you discover that the entire legal system was corrupt to its very core, as high up as you can go, really, and that they had even used a Japanese man as a scapegoat to hide their crimes. Ace Attorney is a Japanese game, made by Japanese people, and it's depicting mostly anti-Japanese racism. There is no way to argue that the game is racist, or that it's showing racism as something that's good. And so the main criticism that I see is that there's racism depicted at all, and that people are uncomfortable seeing it. Let me quote you from an article that I found on Kotaku. It reads, "I understand that this game is set in 19th century Great Britain, and all the racist language the game employs is just a representation of a country rife with racism and xenophobia. I also understand that Adventure was made by Japanese people in Japan. I'm not claiming that the game is racist, only that the amount of racism the game uses in order to be historically accurate is a little over the top, considering nothing else in the game has any claims to accuracy. The things these lawyers get up to, prosecution and defense, would have them disbarred faster than you can say objection." Okay, that's the end of the quote. This argument pretty much is just saying two things. They don't like how much racism is used. They don't like that racism is used at all. It makes them uncomfortable. And they don't think that it's important to have historical accuracy because there are other elements in the game that aren't historically accurate. And I just want to address that second point first, because it's a very popular argument that I am sick of hearing. It's really one of the worst arguments out there. Someone will say something positive in favor of realism and say realism is good or realism is important or immersion is great. And then somebody will say, yeah, how can you advocate for realism in a game where it has a monster that shoots a fireball? Or something like that. They often use fireballs because they'll be magic. This is the stupidest argument. Things like realism and immersion don't exist on a yes or no basis. For example, there's no such thing as a game that's either realistic or unrealistic. There's no game that's immersive or non-immersive. Realism and immersion exist on a slider. They exist on a scale. You can be more immersive, and you can add elements to increase immersion, and you can be more realistic and add elements to increase or decrease realism. It's a scale. It's a slider. It's not a yes or no question. Until a video game is a one-for-one representation of real life, people are always going to be able to use this argument. A video game could be almost perfect, like an almost perfect representation of how real life works, and all real life physics. And then people would say, well, but you're still using a controller. How can you argue in favor of realism? No, stop it. Realism is a feature put in by the developer in certain areas to try and get the player to achieve the intended experience. Whether it works or not is beside the point for the moment. That's what it's there for. And as for Ace Attorney, it actually makes a great deal of effort to try and be historically accurate. A lot went into getting the language to be just right, and to use historically accurate period language. To the point where I've heard some British people tell me that they don't recognize a lot of the things that they say because they're terms that aren't used today. And they talk a lot about things that actually happened, such as the window tax. And Soseki Natsume, the defendant for the second trial in the game, actually was a real person. He was a real Japanese student that went to England and experienced racism at the hands of the English. And there's a lot of details that I don't remember off the top of my head, but I thought at the time were really great. I'm sure there are articles out there listing them all. So it's simply not fair to say that because there's some unrealistic elements in the gameplay and the court system, that the game isn't trying to engender a general sense of realism with all the focus on these details. It's just not true. And as for the claim that it's offensive, or over the top, or just the general feeling that it's making some people uncomfortable, what I would ask those people is, what exactly would you remove? Would you just get rid of the racism and still have it set in the same time period? Well, it just wouldn't be the same game anymore. And there's something ironic about these Western writers that review Eastern games, and they criticize these Japanese games that depict anti-Japanese racism. But if their advice was followed, wouldn't that be more suspicious and blatantly racist? You'd be censoring the misdeeds of the past to appear unproblematic and more palatable to a Western audience today. And that just seems kind of fucked up to me. And that is the end of this video. Please be sure to unsubscribe and leave a dislike, and a negative comment in the comment section is always appreciated. If this video didn't offend you enough to do any of that, then I am sure I will get you in a future video. Until then though, thank you very much for watching.